Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into diabetes, how we got here, and why it has led to so much controversy.
It's astonishing that we're even having this conversation. We're talking about a disease that's been recognized for over 2.5 millennia, and yet the treatment is still so fiercely debated.
2.5 millennia. That's incredible.
It is. The earliest clear diagnosis we have on record comes from Hindu physicians, documented as early as the 6th century BCE.
6th century BCE, that puts it right up there with the oldest chronic illnesses known to humanity. And what's so striking about those ancient observations?
They immediately and really intimately linked it to diet. They saw it as a disease of the wealthy, of those who had access to plentiful food.
And that ancient understanding that what you eat fundamentally drives the disease. That's the thread that just keeps getting tangled, isn't it?
That's the perfect word for it, tangled. Because the history of treating this disease, it feels less like a straight line of progress and more like a never-ending loop.
Right, this circular motion.
Exactly. It was captured perfectly by two British diabetes specialists, Lynn Sawyer and Edwin Gale, back in 2009. They pointed out that these ideas, especially diet trends, they rise, they decline, and then they just reappear a generation later.
And we mistake that for progress.
We confuse circular motion with progress. That's what they said. It's a powerful idea.
It really is. Reminds me of that quote from the source material. Diet has always generated passion, and passion in science is an infallible marker of lack of evidence.
That's a strong indictment of nutritional science, but you see why they'd say it. When the evidence is hard to get or it's ambiguous, dogma, and emotionally charged opinions, they just rush in to fill that void.
And right now, the stakes for getting this right
Yeah.
have never been higher. We're facing a crisis of a scale that is it's terrifying.
It is. I mean, diabetes, especially type 2, it used to be relatively rare in the mid-19th century.
Hospital might go years without seeing a single case.
Way. Exactly. But the prevalence just exploded in the latter half of the 20th century. Federal surveys show a staggering 600% increase in diagnoses in Americans alone between the early 1960s and 2015.
600%. It went from a medical oddity to an epidemiological disaster.
It really did. And while most of these cases are type 2, and they're often simplistically blamed on the rise in obesity.
Right, the whole gluttony and laziness narrative.
Yes, but we have to acknowledge a crucial nuance that just blows that narrative up.
Which is?
That up to 1 in 5 patients with type 2 diabetes are actually lean. They are not overweight, yet they have the exact same metabolic dysfunction.
The lean diabetic. That single fact should make anyone pause and realize the simple calorie in, calorie out model can't possibly be the full story.
It just can't. It demands that we look deeper, at the underlying metabolic problem, the insulin resistance, the hyperinsulinemia, rather than just the symptom of weight gain.
And the urgency is just amplified now, isn't it? People are getting diagnosed earlier.
Much earlier, in their 40s or 50s. And they're expected to live into their 80s with the disease, which means decades of accumulating complications. It's a massive burden.
So to understand how we got into this modern mess, we have to go back. Back to the desperate measures physicians took before the miracle of insulin.
Yes. Let's dive into that pre-insulin era, from corpulence to starvation.
So as you said, in the mid-19th century, this was a rare, fatal disease. What did physicians at the time think it was?
Well, they identified two broad variations. One appeared in middle age, often associated with corpulence or obesity.
Yeah.
They saw it as a problem of excessive formation.
It's a disease of having too much.
Exactly, overnutrition.
And before they settled on diet as a treatment, what were they trying?
Oh, it was chaos. Utter desperation. We're talking steam baths, bloodletting, wine, narcotics, basically anything in the pharmacy they could throw at it.
Because it was death sentence.
It was inevitably fatal. The treatments were just scattershot until the late 18th century.
Which is when the first real successful intervention happens. From a physician named John Rollo in 1796, this seems to be the start of radical dietary restriction.
It really is. His case study of Captain Meredith is just foundational. So Meredith was formerly corpulent, but he'd been losing weight like crazy, suffering from extreme thirst, constant urination.
And classic symptoms.
Classic symptoms. And Rollo's reasoning was simple but revolutionary for the time. He just figured since vegetable foods turn to sugar in the body, they must be restricted completely.
And this led to the animal diet, which sounds, well, it sounds a lot more extreme than just a modern low-carb menu.
It was severe. We are talking about a diet that was almost entirely meat and fat. For lunch, for example, Captain Meredith was prescribed puddings made of blood and suet.
Blood and suet. Wow.
And for dinner, it was old meats and fat, often specified as being as rancid as can be eaten.
Rancid fat.
Mm.
But the results were undeniable.
Absolutely undeniable. Strict adherence to this diet rendered Meredith's urine sugar-free, and crucially, it returned him to health. Rollo proved irrefutably that diet was the key to controlling this disease.
But the pendulum swung even further towards restriction in the early 20th century with Frederick Allen.
Yes, Allen's work redefined everything. He experimented with dogs that had part of their pancreas removed. And his observation was that diabetes wasn't just an inability to metabolize carbs.
But an inability to metabolize any food.
Exactly. Carb, fat, protein, the whole lot. To Allen, this put an unsustainable strain on what was left of the pancreas.
So his solution was starvation therapy.
Severe undernutrition and fasting. It sounds horrific, and it was, but the justification was that it was necessary to prevent diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA.
Which before insulin meant certain death.
Certain death. But it was a brutal, relentless protocol. A German physician called it martyrdom. He said patients were often reduced to mere skeletons.
We have the famous case of Elizabeth Hughes.
Right, daughter of the future Chief Justice. She called the fast days a special nightmare, where she was just confined to bed, starving, all in an effort to prolong her life.
And did it even work? Did it save them from DKA?
It worked sometimes, but at a terrible human cost. Allen himself classified 2/3 of his severe cases as treatment failures, as in fatalities.
So it was just a desperate measure to keep some people alive long enough.
Long enough to hopefully get insulin, which was on the horizon.
This intense focus on restriction leads us straight to Elliot Joslin, probably the most influential diabetologist of the era.
Joslin, whose own mother had diabetes, was meticulous. He was deeply influenced by European thought, especially from Germany. He embraced the principles of Bernhard Naumann,
who taught that a diabetic diet is just an ordinary diet in which the carbohydrates are replaced by fat.
Precisely. So we're back to that high-fat, low-carb philosophy, the core of Rollo's animal diet, reasserting itself as the standard medical approach.
And Joslin's conclusion was unambiguous.
It was. He said, the diabetic's chance for life depends upon his ability to eat fat. So fat-rich diets became the therapy.
But that association between high-fat diets and these severely ill, dying patients would later cause a huge problem, wouldn't it?
A huge problem. The next generation of doctors came to fear fat. They confused the patient's severe state with the therapy that was keeping them alive, and that set the stage for the low-fat era.
That fear is a powerful barrier.
Okay.
Let's talk about the true revolution. We move into the arrival of insulin and the clash of philosophies that followed.
Right. So the breakthrough had been building for decades. The critical link between the pancreas and diabetes was established back in 1889.
And I love the story behind that discovery. It was pure chance.
It was observational genius. A researcher, Minkowski, noticed a house-trained dog in his lab urinating on the floor a lot.
Oh.
He tested the urine, and it was loaded with sugar, and they had just recently removed that dog's pancreas. So he realized all pancreatectomized dogs become diabetic. And just like that, the link was made.
The link was there, but the life-saving extract insulin didn't arrive until the 1920s. And when it did, it was a miracle.
It was nothing short of a miracle. DKA went from a death sentence to a preventable, curable disorder overnight.
Take Joslin's first patient to receive it, Elizabeth Mudge.
A perfect example. She weighed less than 70 pounds. Joslin described her as being just about the weight of her bones in a human soul.
And after insulin.
Within 6 weeks, she was walking 4 miles daily. She regained a significant amount of weight. The effect was just dramatic and immediate.
But the miracle of insulin immediately created a huge debate. If you can survive now, what should you eat?
Exactly. Do you stick with the rigid, near-starvation diets of the past, or do you use insulin as a key to unlock a normal life?
And this split the medical community in two.
Completely polarized it. On one side, you had Joslin. He advocated for what he called his laws of small numbers, minimal insulin, and strict low-carb, calorie-restricted diets.
He was wary of the big doses.
Very wary. He warns that with larger doses, the patient is walking on longer insulin stilts, and his equilibrium is therefore correspondingly endangered. He feared the crash, hypoglycemia.
So diet does the heavy lifting. Insulin is just a supplement.
Yeah.
But the Toronto team, Banting and Best, who discovered the hormone, they had a different idea.
They had more insulin, and they were comfortable using it aggressively to cover more food. Banting, for example, let Elizabeth Hughes eat 1,200 calories a day, peaches, tomatoes, toast.
And she gained 7 pounds in 10 days.
A remarkable recovery. And this philosophy evolved into the free diet movement, championed by people like Dr. Edward Tolstoy in New York.
Tolstoy took it to its logical extreme.
He did. He argued patients should eat what they want and the insulin dose should cover it, even if some sugar remained in the urine, as long as the patient felt healthy.
What was the rationale there? It sounds riskier, but it solved a very human problem.
Adherence. That was the key. Tolstoy realized doctors were fighting a losing battle against human nature.
You mean patients would just cheat on the strict diets?
All the time. He'd tell stories of patients being praised for their cooperation who would then walk straight to the hospital cafeteria for a donut or a chocolate cake.
The moment you tell someone they can't have something.
It's all they want. Tolstoy knew that if a patient couldn't stick to a diet, that diet was useless. He provided a solution that allowed for a degree of normalcy.
But that freedom came with a real physiological cost. The high insulin doses were dangerous.
Yes. To cover all those carbs, patients needed huge doses. 40, 100, sometimes 200 units a day. And this often led to severe hypoglycemia, insulin shock, the exact thing Jocelyn warned about.
It became such a big problem that doctors actually had to, they had to train patients to recognize it.
They did. Some physicians suggested that patients should be intentionally made to experience a mild shock while in the hospital.
Why on earth would they do that?
It was purely educational, so they would recognize the symptoms, the sweating, the confusion, the tremors, and know to immediately treat themselves with sugar, with candy, or corn syrup. It was a survival skill.
And of course, insulin is a fat storage hormone. So flooding the body with it was going to have a predictable side effect on weight.
The weight gain was conspicuous, impossible to ignore. Patients on these high-carb, high-insulin regimens often gained 50 or 60 pounds in a single year. They became definitely overweight.
And for many doctors, that was enough to pump the brakes on the whole free diet idea.
It was. They started questioning why, jam and marmalade were fine, but a rasher of bacon and an extra pat of butter are anathema. The logic seemed inconsistent.
So the argument shifted, and eventually a major clinical trial seemed to push the establishment back toward strict control for good.
That was the Edinburgh clinical trial starting in 1946. They tested the free diet against more restricted diets in new type 2 patients.
And at first, it seemed like the free diet was holding up.
For about 5 years, it looked adequate. There was a warning sign, though. Patients who were obese before diagnosis tended to get obese again very quickly.
But the long-term follow-up was a catastrophe.
Just 3 years later, after 9 years of monitoring, the lead researcher reported the results were disastrous. Those who lacked strict control, the free dieters, had 3 times the rate of complications.
3 times?
And that failure caused him to return to a simple diabetic faith in aggressive, careful control. This moment solidified the idea that tight control was essential, but it critically left the how wide open.
And that set the stage for some major scientific misdirection.
It did,
Yeah.
which takes us into the next phase, how the science got derailed.
Okay, so this brings us to section 3. Our sources highlight 2 core scientific errors that just profoundly derail the treatment of both diabetes and obesity.
These 2 errors are really the foundation of so much of the conventional advice we still hear today. Error number 1, calories in, calories out, simple math.
Right, instead of seeing it as a disorder of hormonal dysregulation dominated by insulin. And error number 2, the overwhelming conviction that the primary dietary villain is saturated fat. Let's start with the energy balance idea, that gaining weight is just a behavioral failure.
That view became so deeply entrenched. Elliot Joslin himself wrote about the patient who allows himself or herself to become fat, placing the blame squarely on willpower.
And this was reinforced by some powerful voices.
It was. In 1929, a researcher named Louis Newberg presented evidence that he claimed had undermined conclusively the theory that obesity had any kind of hormonal cause.
How did he prove that?
He argued that since semi-starvation made everyone lose weight, regardless of their starting point, obesity must just be a matter of eating too much. He completely ignored the possibility that the body might fight that hormonally.
And once the physiological explanation was declared dead,
The vacuum was filled by psychological theories. Researchers started talking about unresolved emotional conflicts or comfort eating. The model shifted to the patient being broken, not their metabolism.
but at the same time, a counter-narrative focusing on hormones was quietly taking shape.
It was. This view identified the endocrine system, and insulin specifically, as the real controller of whether you store fat or burn it.
So insulin isn't just about blood sugar.
Not at all. Insulin stimulates something called de novo lipogenesis, the creation of new fat, mostly from carbohydrates. And it makes sure that fat gets locked away in your fat cells.
So when you eat carbs, your blood sugar goes up, pancreas releases insulin, and that insulin is also actively telling your body to store any extra energy as fat.
Precisely. And for someone who's insulin resistant, the root of type 2 diabetes, their pancreas has to pump out massive amounts of insulin just to keep blood sugar normal.
This leads to hyperinsulinemia,
Right.
high circulating insulin.
Right. And that state naturally promotes fat storage while at the same time blocking the release of stored fat.
Yeah.
It literally traps the energy inside your fat cells.
Which explains why calories in, calories out fail so spectacularly for these individuals. Their body is hormonally programmed to store fat.
It shifts the focus from willpower to biochemistry. But this crucial understanding was just overwhelmed by that second error, the fear of saturated fat.
The AHA dogma. How did the low-fat message become so dominant?
It had two things going for it. It was simple, and it came first. The idea started way back in the mid-19th century when a pathologist named Rudolf Virchow saw fat and cholesterol deposits in atherosclerotic plaques.
And then came the rabbit experiment.
Yes. In 1913, Nikolai Anichkow induced these plaques in rabbits just by feeding them cholesterol. This led to his famous declaration, there can be no atherosclerosis without cholesterol.
And that provided the aura of experimental support.
It did, even though, as you know, rabbits are herbivores and are not designed to eat cholesterol. That context was kind of overlooked. By the mid-20th century, the American Heart Association had embraced the low-fat, low-cholesterol message as dogma.
So while fat was being demonized, there was this compelling alternative theory linking modern diseases to something else entirely.
Sugar and refined carbs. This was the nutrition transition observation. As poor populations around the world adopted Western diets, they inevitably got the same diseases: obesity, heart disease, and diabetes.
And this coincided perfectly with the explosion of cheap sugar.
The Industrial Revolution made it a staple, not a luxury. And doctors noticed the link early. At a 1907 medical meeting, they pointed to the rise in sugar consumption among newly prosperous patients as the prime suspect for the rise in diabetes.
Which is identical to what the ancient Hindu physicians said in the 6th century BCE.
It's a 2,500-year-old observation, but the sugar hypothesis was dismissed by the most influential figures of the day, like Joslin.
Why? The link seems so clear.
Their dismissal was based on what they saw as inconsistent data. They'd look at League of Nations reports and see that, say, Australia and Norway had high sugar consumption but different diabetes mortality rates. So they concluded sugar, as such, is not related in a causal way.
That statistical hurdle, combined with the fat phobia, allowed a compromise theory to take over, the one focused on fiber deficiency.
This is where the refined carb hypothesis was basically neutralized. So you had British researchers like Cleve and Yudkin arguing forcefully that these were saccharin diseases caused by the type of carbs.
But then the focus shifted.
It did. Researchers working in Africa noticed the lack of fiber in the refined Western diet, and they shifted the focus from the toxicity of the sugar itself to the deficiency of fiber that results from refining it.
That's a huge shift in framing. It's not that the food is harmful.
It's that the food is missing something. It's a deficiency disease, not a toxicity problem. And this compromise was perfect because it could be reconciled with the AHEAD dogma.
So doctors didn't have to tell patients to stop eating bread and sugar.
They just had to tell them to eat more whole grains. And with that, the direct link between sugar, processed grains, and diabetes just vanished from the medical consensus.
It's a classic case of dogma hijacking a competing hypothesis. Okay, let's jump forward. Section 4. Modern dilemmas and the search for control. The 1960s bring a discovery that should have challenged all of this.
It should have. This was the radioimmunoassay developed by Yalow and Burson, which let them accurately measure hormones in the blood. And their discovery fundamentally redefined type 2 diabetes.
What was that breakthrough finding?
They found that type 2 diabetes is primarily a disorder of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. High circulating insulin. It's not an insulin deficiency, at least not at first.
The pancreas is working overtime.
5 to 7 times the normal amount until it eventually burns out. But doctors were still being taught that insulin's only role was to control blood sugar, ignoring its powerful role in fat metabolism.
Which creates a huge conflict for treatment. If the disease is rooted in too much insulin, then injecting more insulin to lower blood sugar seems counterintuitive.
It is entirely counterintuitive and potentially dangerous. One researcher, Roz Lasker, questioned the whole idea of giving intensive insulin to type 2 patients, asking if the high doses would have deleterious effects that offset any potential benefits.
You mean because the high insulin levels themselves could be accelerating heart disease?
Exactly. The scientific consensus is that high circulating insulin is a massive risk factor for arterial plaque buildup. So the very treatment could be fueling the complication that actually kills most diabetics.
And the top experts recognize this conflict.
Oh, absolutely. A leading expert, Ralph DeFronzo, in a major lecture, concluded that promoting intensive insulin for type 2 is fundamentally a mistake. You're adding insulin to a state of insulin excess. It's just wrong.
Meanwhile, the focus on controlling blood sugar became highly quantified with the discovery of the A1C test.
Right. The hemoglobin A1C discovery in 1968 gave doctors a long-term measure of blood sugar control, and they quickly learned that a high A1C, even in a safe range, correlated directly with a higher risk of heart disease, stroke, and premature death.
This gave us objective evidence of the damage from what the sources call the sugar fire.
Mm.
How exactly does that fire cause so much damage?
Through a process called glycation. It's the chemical binding of glucose molecules to proteins throughout your body. And this creates toxic compounds called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs.
And this explains all the diabetic complications.
All of them. Retinopathy in the eyes, neuropathy in the nerves, nephropathy in the kidneys. It's all from this glycation process.
There's a stunning analogy in the sources to describe this stiffening process.
Yes, from the researcher Sarimi. He said that removing the aorta from an elderly person with chronic high blood sugar is like trying to inflate a pipe. It can't be expanded. If you keep adding more pressure, it will just burst.
The sugar fire is causing structural damage. It's literally making your tissues prematurely old and stiff.
Exactly. So given this clear damage, all hope was placed on achieving tight control. You would expect major trials aiming for that to show a massive reduction in heart disease and stroke.
But that's not what happened.
It's not what happened at all. This is the massive paradox of modern diabetes management.
Okay, so let's look at those key trials. First, the UKPDS, the United Kingdom Prospective Diabetes Study for type 2 patients.
Right. Published in 1998, it used intensive drug therapy. And the results.
It did reduce the microvascular complications, the damage to small vessels in the eyes and kidneys.
But it came at a cost. More hypoglycemia, significant weight gain, and crucially, it had no measurable effect on macrovascular complications.
No reduction in heart attacks. No reduction in strokes. It failed to address the biggest killer.
It failed completely on that front.
Then we had the DCCT, the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial for type 1 patients.
The DCCT in 1993, it also confirmed that intensive insulin reduced those small vessel complications. But again, it led to more weight gain and more severe hypo episodes.
And there's an interesting detail in that one about the diet.
A very telling detail. The investigators actually changed the protocol mid-trial to adopt the ADA's recommended high-carb diet, 45–50% of calories from carbs.
So they changed the diet mid-study to conform to professional guidelines, even though that diet was actively contributing to the weight gain side effect.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how entrenched dogma can override clinical observation, even in a gold standard trial. They were prescribing a diet that demanded more insulin, leading to more risk, just to conform.
And finally, the Look Ahead trial. This was the definitive test of the low-fat, calorie-restricted diet model for preventing heart attacks.
It was. They tested a low-fat ADA diet plus intensive exercise. They wanted to see if sustained weight loss, which they did achieve, about 6% could reduce cardiovascular events in type 2 patients.
And the outcome.
The trial was stopped early. Not because it failed to produce weight loss, it succeeded there, but because it failed its primary goal. It did not prevent heart attacks or strokes.
So the conventional approach, restricting calories and fat while managing high carbs with drugs and exercise,
failed to save lives from the major complications of type 2 diabetes. The evidence was just building that this high-carb diet was fundamentally incompatible with long-term vascular health for diabetics.
Which brings us to the resurgence of the oldest approach of all, Section 5, the low-carb resurgence.
This is rooted in those foundational observations from Rollo and Nonin. If you restrict the carbohydrates, you limit the fuel source the body can't handle, you reduce the demand on the failing system.
It's the diet of less demand philosophy.
Exactly. Charles Best, the co-discoverer of insulin, suggested way back in 1940 that high-fat diets rest the pancreas. If the system isn't constantly being forced to secrete massive amounts of insulin, it can rest.
And this logic seems to be hardwired into biology. I'm thinking of Kurt Richter's animal studies.
Yes. In the 1940s, he studied pancreatectomized rats diabetic animals and found that if given a choice, they instinctively selected diets high in fat and low in carbs.
They chose the therapeutic diet on their own.
They maintained homeostasis by avoiding the food that made them sick. It's a powerful idea. And this approach finally became clinically viable for humans thanks to technology.
Right. The at-home glucose meters and then the continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs.
Those were game changers. Suddenly, patients could become their own researchers. They no longer had to rely on a doctor telling them their control was good.
They could see it for themselves. In real time, that bowl of cereal spiking their blood sugar to dangerous levels.
Exactly. This immediate objective feedback empowered people like Dr. Richard Bernstein, who has type 1 diabetes.
And he advocated for normalizing blood sugar, not just acceptable control.
Yes, aiming for truly healthy levels using minimal carbs and minimal insulin. He called it his laws of small numbers, a direct echo of Joslин's cautions from the 1920s.
And now we have compelling modern clinical evidence supporting this for both type 1 and type 2.
We do. In the type 1 community, take the Dykman family. Their 9-year-old son was diagnosed. When the parents suggested a low-carb diet, the endocrinologist laughed at them.
He laughed.
But they did it anyway, following Bernstein's approach. And their son's A1C dropped from a highly dangerous 11% down to a near-perfect 5.7%.
That's exceptional control.
Yeah.
And for the much larger type 2 population, we have the Virta Health trial.
That's the definitive large-scale data. They used nutritional ketosis with continuous remote care. The 5-year results were stunning. 1/3 of patients who stuck with it showed no clinical signs of diabetes. They achieved remission.
Remission. And what about those on insulin?
Half of those who started on insulin therapy were able to stop it completely. It confirmed the effectiveness of this approach for actual disease reversal.
And it's not just in research trials, it's happening in general practice.
Right. Dr. David Unwin, a UK GP, he'd been giving the eat less, exercise more advice for years and saw 0 patients benefit. So he switched to a carbohydrate-restricted diet for his type 2 patients.
And the results?
He achieved diabetes remission in 46% of them and saved his clinic a significant amount of money on medications.
The results seem overwhelming, yet the medical community, especially in pediatrics, remains hesitant. Why?
Well, pediatric endocrinologists openly admit that curbing carbs makes type 1 diabetes much easier to control. There's no doubt about it, one said. But they articulate a fundamental fear.
The fear of the unknown.
They fear the evils they don't know. The theoretical risks of DKA, hypoglycemia, the long-term sustainability of these diets.
So they default to the evils they know.
Precisely. They have decades of experience managing the complications of the high-carb diet, the weight gain, the high insulin doses, the higher A1C levels. Managing those known evils feels institutionally safer than embracing a radical alternative, even if the short-term results are dramatically better.
This leads us into our final section. The conflicts of evidence and the path forward. The science and history seem to point one way, but medical practice continues in another.
It's a classic dilemma. It's rooted in the inherent uncertainty of medicine. What we call the right prescription is often just a product of expert consensus, not hard data. And those big, long-term nutritional experiments are just prohibitively difficult and expensive.
So where hard evidence is missing, consensus becomes the guide, even if that consensus is flawed.
It creates a reliance on safety in numbers. One pioneer of evidence-based medicine said physicians often check a procedure not against reality, but against whether it agrees with a consensus that was also unreliable.
The premise of evidence-based medicine was that half of what doctors are taught is dead wrong.
Exactly. The system is designed for consistency, which often means being slow to change.
And this leads to what the sources call the untested risk.
Which is the assumption that the conventional advice entails the least risk. And this forces us to confront the central controversial question, is it possible that the current carbohydrate-rich diets, even when covered by insulin, are causing long-term harm?
That they're accelerating the very complications we're trying to prevent.
Compared to a diet where those carbs are just absent, that's the question the big trials failed to answer.
They failed to prevent heart disease, the #1 killer.
And that failure should have been a massive red flag. The implicit assumption of those trials was that the method of achieving control doesn't matter, only that you achieve it.
So when their hypothesis failed, they just retained their preconceptions. The low-fat, high-carb model remained.
They doubled down on it, shedding no light on the alternative that addresses the underlying hormonal problem.
Okay, let's bring this full circle. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
We've traced that historical pendulum. From Rollo's radical animal diets through Allen's starvation to the high-carb free eating of the post-insulin era, we highlighted those profound scientific errors, seeing obesity as just energy balance and the powerful but flawed conviction that saturated fat is the villain.
And we've seen that despite the failures of the big conventional trials to stop heart disease, emerging clinical evidence from places like Verta Health shows that challenging the status quo with carb restriction can lead to remission and remarkable control.
And we established that the underlying physiology of type 2 is insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. So the question isn't just about blood sugar. It's about overall metabolic health and putting out that sugar fire of glycation.
So we end where we started, with the core controversy. If the goal of therapy is restoring homeostasis, what's the best strategy?
Right. Should we prioritize giving patients ever-increasing amounts of insulin to handle the carbs they eat, which just exacerbates the underlying problem of too much insulin? Or should we fundamentally change the diet to drastically reduce that insulin demand, allowing the body to finally rest and recover?
That's the crucial unresolved question.
It is. If carbohydrates are the poison that demands treatment, maybe the solution isn't how much antidote we can safely take, but how little poison we need in the first place.
A thought that should guide every patient and physician moving forward. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Be sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting platform for more deep dives.